He thought he was God in that courtroom. Judge Lawrence Gannon didn't just sentence people, he destroyed them. And on a humid Tuesday in July, he had his sights set on Darius, a quiet 18-year-old black kid with a scholarship and a terrified look in his eyes. Gannon smirked, leaned over the bench, and threatened to bury the boy under the jail for a crime he didn't commit. He thought Darius was alone. He thought Darius was weak. But the judge made one fatal mistake. He didn't check who was about to walk through those double doors. You are not going to believe who Darius's father really is, and the brutal karma that hit this corrupt judge is something you have to see to believe. The air conditioning in the fictional precinct of Oakhaven County Courthouse had been broken for 3 days, but Judge Lawrence Gannon didn't seem to sweat. He sat high upon his mahogany bench, a man carved from ice and arrogance, his black robe hanging off his shoulders like the wings of a vulture. To the locals, Gannon wasn't just a judge. He was the gatekeeper of Oakhaven. If you were wealthy, white, and connected to the country club on Willow Creek, Gannon was a merciful grandfather. But if you looked like Darius Webb, 18 years old, black, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit his mother had bought from a thrift store, Gannon was the executioner. Darius sat at the defense table, his hands trembling so hard he had to clasp them together to stop the shaking. He was an honor roll student. He had a partial scholarship to Georgia Tech waiting for him in the fall. He had never even had a detention, let alone a criminal record. But none of that mattered now. "Mr. Taggart," Judge Gannon droned, his voice thick with a southern drawl that sounded more like a threat than a greeting. He didn't even look at Darius. He looked at the prosecutor, a weaselly man named Paul Taggart, who wore expensive cologne that barely masked the scent of stale tobacco. "Are we ready to proceed? I have a tea time at 3, and I do not intend to miss it, because this individual wants to play innocent." Darius flinched. Individual. The way Gannon said it made him feel less than human. "Ready, Your Honor," Taggart smirked, shuffling his papers. "The state is prepared to show that the defendant, Mr. Webb, was the aggressor in the robbery of the convenience store on 4th and Main." "Objection!" Darius's public defender, a frazzled woman named Blaze Miller, shot up. She was young, overworked, and clearly terrified of Gannon. "Your Honor, we have security footage that clearly shows my client was 3 blocks away." "Overruled." Gannon slammed his gavel down before she could finish. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Sit down, Ms. Miller. I've seen the footage. It's grainy, it's dark, it could be anyone. And frankly, given the defendant's profile, it fits." Given the defendant's profile. Darius felt a cold pit open in his stomach. He looked back at the gallery. It was mostly empty, save for his aunt, who was weeping silently into a handkerchief. His mother couldn't get off work. If she missed another shift at the diner, they'd lose the apartment. He was alone. Judge Gannon finally turned his gaze toward Darius. His eyes were pale blue, devoid of any warmth. He took off his reading glasses and cleaned them slowly, a predator playing with its food. "Boy," Gannon said. He didn't use his name. "You are looking at 10 to 15 years for aggravated robbery. You hurt a local business owner. You disrupted the peace of my town. Now, Mr. Taggart here has been generous enough to offer a plea deal. 5 years. You take it, you go away. We all go home." "I didn't do it," Darius whispered, his voice cracking. Gannon leaned forward, his face twisting into a scowl. "Speak up when you address this court." "I didn't do it, Your Honor," Darius said, louder this time, tears stinging his eyes. "I was walking home from the library. I have the receipt for the books I checked out. The timestamp." "I don't care about your library books," Gannon roared, his face turning a blotchy red. I care about law and order. You people think you can just march into my courtroom and lie to my face? I can see it in your eyes, son. You're guilty. And if you waste my time with a trial, I promise you I will make sure you never see the outside of a prison cell until you are an old, broken man. The trial, if you could call it that, was a farce. It was a railroad job, pure and simple. Prosecutor Taggart called up his only witness, the store clerk, Mr. Henderson. Henderson was an elderly man with cataracts and a history of confusion. He squinted at Darius from the witness stand. "Is this the man who robbed you?" Taggart asked, pointing a long finger at Darius. Henderson hesitated. He looked at Darius, then at the judge. Judge Gannon cleared his throat loudly, tapping his pen against the bench. It was a subtle signal, but Henderson caught it. I think so," Henderson stammered. "It happened so fast. He was wearing a hoodie." "But Darius wasn't wearing a hoodie that night," Blaze Miller argued during cross-examination. "He was wearing a button-down shirt from his job at the cinema. We have his uniform logged—" "Enough!" Gannon interrupted again. "Ms. Miller, you are badgering the witness. Mr. Henderson has identified the perpetrator. Move on." "But, Your Honor, an identification based on 'I think so' is not beyond a reasonable doubt," Blaze pleaded, her hands shaking as she held up her notes. "And we haven't even discussed the police report. Officer Reynolds admitted on the scene that the suspect was 6 feet tall. Darius is 5'7". Gannon laughed. It was a dry, cruel sound. "People shrink when they're scared, Miss Miller, and frankly, I've heard enough. The evidence is clear to me. This boy is a menace." Darius looked at the court stenographer, a middle-aged woman who kept her eyes glued to her machine, refusing to witness the injustice happening 3 feet away from her. He looked at the bailiff, a burly man named Officer Griggs, who was chewing gum and scrolling on his phone, completely indifferent to the fact that a life was being ended. This was how it happened, Darius realized. This is how you disappear. You don't vanish in a puff of smoke. You get erased by paperwork, by bored men in power, by a system that decided you were guilty the moment you were born. "We will break for lunch," Gannon announced, checking his gold Rolex. 1 hour. When we return, I expect the defense to rest. And Darius—" Gannon fixed his eyes on the teenager again. "Use this hour to think about that 5-year plea deal. Because if I have to come back here and listen to more of these pathetic excuses, I'm giving you 20 years. Try me." Gannon banged the gavel and swept out of the room. Darius slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. Blaze Miller put a hand on his shoulder, but there was no comfort in it. She knew they were losing. "I'm sorry, Darius," she whispered. He's never been this bad. He's up for re-election, and he wants to look tough on crime for the voters. You're a prop to him." "I can't go to jail," Darius sobbed quietly. "I have school. I have a life." "I know," Blaze said, her voice hollow. "I know." 1 hour later, the courtroom was stiflingly hot. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of floor wax and fear. Judge Gannon returned, looking refreshed. He had likely had a nice lunch at the club, maybe a drink or two. His face was slightly flushed. He sat down and glared at the defense table. "Well," Gannon barked, "Mr. Webb, have you come to your senses?" Darius stood up. His legs felt like lead. He looked at the empty doors at the back of the courtroom. He had prayed during the break that someone would save him, that God would intervene. But the doors remained shut. I can't confess to something I didn't do, Your Honor," Darius said, his voice barely a whisper. The courtroom went silent. Gannon's eyes narrowed into slits. He leaned into his microphone, his voice dropping to a menacing growl that reverberated through the speakers. "You listen to me, "You arrogant little thug," Gannon spat. "I gave you a chance, a gift, and you spit in my face? You think you're smart? You think because you got some little scholarship that you're better than the law? No, sir, Shut up!" Gannon screamed, losing his composure entirely. "I am the law in this county. Me! And I say you are a danger to society. I am going to make an example of you. I am going to send you to the state penitentiary, and I am going to recommend maximum security. You will rot in there. You hear me? You will rot." Taggart, the prosecutor, smirked, leaning back in his chair. He had won. It was over. "I am hereby revoking your bail," Gannon announced, grabbing his gavel. "And I am prepared to issue a summary judgment based on the overwhelming evidence and the defendant's lack of cooperation. Get the handcuffs, Griggs." Officer Griggs stepped forward, unhooking the cuffs from his belt. The metallic click of the safety coming off echoed in the room. Darius began to hyperventilate. He saw his future dissolving, the college campus, the degree, the life he promised his mum he'd have. All gone. "Please," Darius begged. "Please, just look at the camera footage again. Please." "Take him away." Gannon waved his hand dismissively. "Get him out of my sight." Griggs grabbed Darius by the arm, roughly twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Darius's shoulder. Tears streamed down his face. "Wait!" Blaze Miller cried out, but Gannon ignored her. "Court is adjourned." Gannon raised the gavel high, ready to seal Darius's fate. Boom! The double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They were thrown open with such force that they slammed against the back walls, the sound louder than Gannon's gavel. Every head in the courtroom whipped around. Even Judge Gannon froze, his gavel hovering in midair. Standing in the doorway was a silhouette, a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that cost more than Judge Gannon made in 5 years. The tailoring was impeccable, charcoal grey, Italian cut. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. But it wasn't the suit that commanded attention. It was the way he walked. He strode down the center aisle with a terrifying calmness. His footsteps on the wooden floor were slow, deliberate, and heavy. Clack, clack, clack. Behind him, 2 other men entered. They were wearing dark sunglasses and earpieces, federal marshals. Judge Gannon squinted. He didn't recognize the man immediately, but he recognized the aura of power. This wasn't a local lawyer. This wasn't a distraught family member. This was a shark entering a goldfish pond. "Excuse me," Gannon shouted, trying to regain control of his courtroom. "This is a closed session. You cannot just barge in here. Bailiff, remove this man." Officer Griggs let go of Darius and stepped into the aisle, putting a hand on his taser. "Sir, you need to step back. Now." The man didn't even look at Griggs. He simply held up a single hand, palm out, and Griggs froze. It was an instinctual reaction to authority. The man stopped at the railing, just behind the defense table. He looked at Darius. For the first time since the nightmare began, Darius saw kindness. The man's eyes, dark, intense, and deeply intelligent, softened as they met Darius's terrified gaze. He gave the boy a barely perceptible nod. "It's okay." Then, the man turned his eyes to Judge Gannon. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard steel that made Gannon's blood run cold. "Who do you think you are?" Gannon sputtered, though his voice wavered. "Identify yourself before I hold you in contempt." The stranger placed his briefcase on the empty table next to Blaze Miller. He snapped the latches open. Click, click. "My name," the stranger said, his voice a rich baritone that filled the room without the need for a microphone, "is Alexander Hale." A gasp went through the courtroom. Blaze Miller dropped her pen. Prosecutor Taggart stopped smiling. His face went pale white. Even Gannon froze. The name hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Alexander Hale wasn't just a lawyer. He was the former Solicitor General of the United States. He was currently the senior partner at Hale, Sterling and O'Connor, the most powerful defense firm in Washington, D.C. He was a man who argued before the Supreme Court for breakfast. He was a legend. Mr. Hale, Gannon stammered. I wasn't aware you were in Oak Haven. To what do we owe the honor? Alexander Hale didn't smile. He walked through the gate, ignoring the bailiff, and stood right next to Darius. He placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. I am here, Hale said, his voice slicing through the silence, because you are currently threatening to imprison my son. The silence that followed was absolute. Darius looked up, confused. Son? He didn't know this man. His father had left before he was born. His mother never spoke of him. Gannon blinked rapidly. Your son? Mr. Hale, there must be a mistake. This is Darius Webb. His father is listed as unknown on the birth certificate. He is a local, indigent. Biologically, perhaps, Hale said smoothly. But I have been watching Darius for 18 years. I have paid for his schooling. I have watched him grow into a young man of integrity. And I have watched you, Judge Gannon, torment him for the last 3 hours on a live stream feed provided by my associates. Hale gestured to the back of the room. One of the federal marshals held up a small device. You recorded this? Gannon asked, sweat finally breaking out on his forehead. That is illegal. That is a violation of courtroom protocol. Actually, Hale countered, pulling a document from his briefcase. Under Federal Statute 18, Section 4, regarding civil rights investigations, federal observation overrides local protocol when there is credible suspicion of judicial misconduct. And Judge, Hale smiled, a terrifying, predatory smile. We have more than suspicion. This is outrageous, Taggart squeaked from the prosecution table. You can't just waltz in here and claim relation to the defendant to disrupt a trial. Hale turned his head slowly to look at Taggart. Mr. Taggart, I see you're still practicing law. I recall reading your file when you applied to my firm 5 years ago. Hale paused. We burned it. Taggart slumped back, silenced. Hale turned back to the judge. I am entering my appearance as lead counsel for Mr. Webb, effective immediately, and I am filing a motion to dismiss all charges with prejudice. On what grounds? Gannon demanded, trying to find his footing. You have no evidence. The boy was identified. On the grounds, Hale said, reaching into his briefcase again and pulling out a thick manila envelope. That I have the GPS data from Mr. Webb's phone, which places him exactly where he said he was. I also have the unaltered security footage from the store, the one your police department accidentally compressed to make the suspect look darker and shorter. My private investigators recovered the original file from the store's hard drive 20 minutes ago. Hale tossed the flash drive onto the judge's bench. It skittered across the mahogany and hit Gannon's gavel. But more importantly, Hale continued, his voice dropping an octave, I have the bank records of the victim, Mr. Henderson. It seems he received a cash deposit of $5,000 2 days ago from a shell company registered to... Let's see. Hale pretended to read the paper. Oh, yes. A shell company registered to your brother-in-law, Judge Gannon. The room erupted. The eruption in the courtroom wasn't a cheer. It was a collective gasp of shock that sucked the air right out of the room. The court reporter stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys, her mouth agape. Judge Gannon slammed his gavel down, but the sound was weak, desperate. Order! Order, I say! This is preposterous! This is slander! Gannon's face had gone from a flush of anger to a sickly, pale grey. He stood up, his robes looking suddenly too big for him. "Mr. Hale, you have marched into my courtroom, disrupted a judicial proceeding, and accused a sitting judge of a felony. I will have you disbarred. I will have you arrested right now." Gannon pointed a shaking finger at the bailiff. "Griggs, arrest this man. Arrest him for contempt of court and obstruction of justice." Officer Griggs looked at Alexander Hale. Then he looked at the two federal marshals standing behind Hale, their arms crossed, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Griggs, not being a smart man but certainly a survivor, took a slow step backward. He wasn't going to tackle a former Solicitor General protected by feds. "Griggs!" Gannon screamed, his voice cracking. "Officer Griggs is wise to stay where he is," Hale said calmly. He hadn't moved an inch. He was still standing next to Darius, looking at the judge with an expression of pure pity. "Because if he touches me, he will be an accessory to a federal crime. And frankly, Your Honor, I don't think he's on the payroll like Mr. Henderson was." "That transfer proves nothing," Prosecutor Taggart shouted, jumping up. He was sweating profusely now. It's a loan. A personal loan. You have no context." "Context?" Hale raised an eyebrow. He turned to the defense table and picked up a remote control. "Let's look at context." Hale pointed the remote at the large monitor mounted on the wall, usually used for displaying evidence like traffic diagrams. The screen flickered to life. It was a video. Grainy, low light, taken from a hidden camera. It showed the inside of a dimly lit bar. Two men were sitting in a booth. One was Judge Gannon. The other was Paul Taggart. The audio crackled. Then Gannon's voice came through, clear as a bell. "We need to fill the beds, Paul. The private prison contract is up for renewal next month. If we don't show a 95% occupancy rate in the juvenile wing, they cut our kickback. I need bodies." On screen, Taggart took a sip of beer. "I'm trying, Lawrence. But crime is down. The kids aren't biting." "Then make them bite," Gannon's voice growled on the recording. "Pick up the stragglers. Loitering, truancy, petty theft. Upgrade the charges. Aggravated robbery carries a mandatory minimum. Find a kid with no dad, no money, and a public defender who doesn't care. Railroad him. I don't care who it is. Just get me a conviction." The video cut to black. The silence in the courtroom was heavier than lead. It was the silence of a grave. Darius stared at the black screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were talking about me. He wasn't a person to them. He was a vacancy to be filled, a number on a spreadsheet to secure a kickback. Blaze Miller, the public defender, looked like she was going to be sick. She covered her mouth with her hand, realizing how many other guilty kids she had watched Gannon send away. Hale turned back to the bench. "That video was recorded 3 weeks ago. Since then, my team has been building a RICO case against you, Mr. Taggart, and the warden of the Oak Haven Juvenile Detention Center." Gannon collapsed into his chair. It wasn't a figurative collapse. His legs literally gave out. He slumped back, clutching the armrests, his breathing ragged. You can't," Gannon whispered. "I can," Hale said, his voice hard as granite. "And I did. But I wasn't going to reveal it until tomorrow. I was waiting for the final wire transfer to hit your offshore account. But then I saw you go after Darius. I saw you threatening a boy with a future, and I decided I couldn't wait another day." Hale walked around the table and stood directly in front of the prosecutor. Taggart was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. "Mr. Taggart," Hale said softly, "I suggest you sit down and start writing a resignation letter. Although, where you're going, you won't need a pen." The silence that followed Alexander Hale's revelation regarding the bank transfer was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and electric. It hung over the courtroom like the pressure before a tornado touches down. Judge Lawrence Gannon sat frozen on his bench. The blood had drained from his face so completely that his skin looked like old parchment. His hand, which had been reaching for his gavel to silence the room, hovered in mid-air, trembling with a palsy of pure terror. For years, Gannon had treated this courtroom as his personal kingdom. He had decided who slept in their own beds and who slept in a cage. He had destroyed families with a stroke of his pen, fueled by arrogance and the belief that he was untouchable. But now, staring at the former Solicitor General of the United States, Gannon realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach that he was not the hunter. He was the prey. "A shell company," Gannon finally choked out, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous room. That is a baseless accusation. You are guessing, Mr. Hale. You are throwing mud at the wall to see what sticks." "I don't guess, Lawrence," Hale replied. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a deep baritone that didn't need to shout to be heard. He stepped away from the defense table, moving into the open floor of the court, commanding the space. "And I certainly don't throw mud. I throw anvils." Hale turned to the jury box, which was empty as Gannon had denied Darius a jury trial, and then to the gallery, ensuring everyone heard him. "You see, Judge, you made a mistake common among men of your particular appetite for greed. You assumed that because you were the law in Oakhaven, no one was watching. But the federal government is always watching when the numbers don't add up." Hale signaled to the back of the room. The lead federal marshal, Agent Reynolds, stepped forward. He held a laptop connected to the court's projector system. "What is this?" Prosecutor Paul Taggart squeaked. Taggart was standing now, clutching his briefcase to his chest like a shield. Sweat was pouring down his temples, ruining his expensive haircut. "You cannot introduce evidence that hasn't been discovered. This is a violation of procedure." "This isn't evidence for the trial, Mr. Taggart," Hale said, fixing the prosecutor with a look of absolute disdain. "This is the probable cause for the warrant we executed on your offices 10 minutes ago." The large screen on the wall, usually used to show traffic diagrams or mug shots, flickered to life. The resolution was crystal clear. It was a video recording. The timestamp in the corner read, June 14th, 8:45 p.m. The scene was the private dining room of the Willow Creek Country Club. The camera angle was from a button cam, likely worn by a waiter or a busboy. In the frame, sitting at a table laden with steak and scotch, were Judge Gannon, Prosecutor Taggart, and a third man, the warden of the Oakhaven Private Correctional Facility. The courtroom gasped collectively. On the screen, Gannon was laughing, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth. He looked powerful, relaxed, the exact opposite of the shaking man currently sitting on the bench. "The contract renewal is next month, gentlemen," the video Gannon said, pouring more scotch. "Corporate is breathing down my neck. They need occupancy at 90% to trigger the bonus clause. We are currently sitting at 75. Taggart's voice on the video was whiny, compliant. "We're pulling in everyone we can, Lawrence, but the crime rate is down. The kids just aren't screwing up enough." Gannon slammed his hand on the table in the video. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. "Then stop waiting for them to screw up. Create the screw-ups. Loitering becomes resisting arrest. Shoplifting becomes strong-arm robbery. Find the weak ones, the ones with single mums, the ones who can't afford a lawyer who gives a damn. You feed them into the grinder, Paul. You get me my numbers, and I get us our payout." The warden in the video chuckled. "Just make sure the paperwork is clean. I don't want the ACLU sniffing around." "Screw the ACLU," Gannon sneered on screen, raising his glass. "In Oakhaven, I am God." The screen went black. In the real courtroom, The silence was absolute. Darius stared at the blank monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might crack them. He felt sick, physically ill. He wasn't a person to them. He wasn't a student with dreams of engineering. He was a percentage point. He was inventory to be stocked on a shelf so a judge could get a bonus check. Blaze Miller, the public defender, had her hand over her mouth. She was crying silently, realizing how many other boys she had failed, how many other Dariuses were currently sitting in cells because of this conspiracy. You illegally recorded a private conversation, Gannon whispered. He was gripping the edge of his bench so hard his knuckles were white. That is inadmissible. Under the Patriot Act, Section 213, and the RICO statutes regarding organized crime syndicates, Hale recited from memory, his voice hard as steel. Federal surveillance is authorized without a warrant when there is a clear and present danger to the civil liberties of the public. You aren't a judge anymore, Lawrence. You're a racketeer. Hale turned to the two federal marshals. Execute the warrant. The moment that followed was one of pure, unadulterated chaos. Agent Reynolds and his partner moved up the center aisle with the speed and precision of predators. Their movements were heavy, deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. No! Gannon shrieked. He scrambled backward, his chair rolling into the wall behind him with a loud crash. He looked around wildly for an escape, but he was trapped in the high castle he had built for himself. Griggs, bailiff, do your duty. Protect this bench. Officer Griggs, the burly bailiff who had happily twisted Darius's arm only an hour ago, looked at the federal marshals. He looked at the badges clipped to their belts. He looked at the guns on their hips. Griggs slowly unclipped his radio from his belt, placed it on the defense table, and took 3 large steps backward, putting his hands in the air. I'm out, Griggs muttered. I ain't dying for you, Lawrence. You traitor! Gannon screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. I made you. Agent Reynolds ascended the steps to the bench. He didn't ask Gannon to stand. He reached out, grabbed the front of the judge's silk robes, and hauled him to his feet. Lawrence Gannon, Reynolds boomed, his voice projecting to the back of the room. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, wire fraud, racketeering, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Get your hands off me, Gannon flailed, kicking out like a toddler. I have immunity. I know the governor. I'll have your badge. Reynolds spun Gannon around and slammed him face first onto the mahogany surface of the bench, the same surface where he had signed countless warrants. Click, click. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting tight was sharp, mechanical, and infinitely satisfying. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. You have the right to remain silent, Reynolds said, yanking Gannon upright. And I strongly suggest you use it, because you have talked enough. As they dragged the judge down the steps, his robe bunched up around his waist, revealing his trembling legs. He looked small, pathetic. The monster under the bed had been dragged into the light, and he was nothing but a frightened old man. Paul! Gannon screamed as he was hauled past the prosecution table. Paul, tell them it was your idea. Paul Taggart didn't answer. He was currently vomiting into his wastebasket, the reality of his own future crashing down on him. Agent Reynolds paused as they passed Darius. He stopped, holding Gannon by the scruff of his neck. Gannon, panting and sweating, was forced to look Darius in the eye. Darius stood up. He didn't look down. He didn't look away. For the first time all day, he stood at his full height. I didn't do it, Darius said softly. Gannon opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to curse, but Reynolds yanked him forward. Move it! As the double doors swung shut behind the disgraced judge, a strange energy filled the room. The air felt lighter. The oppressive heat seemed to break. But the legal matter was still unresolved. Darius was technically still a defendant. "Order!" a female voice commanded. It wasn't Gannon. The voice came from the doorway behind the bench, the judge's chambers. A woman stepped out. She was wearing a simple navy suit, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She walked with a dignity that Gannon could never feign. It was Eleanor Rodriguez, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. A murmur rippled through the gallery. She was a legend in the state, known for being tough, fair, and utterly intolerant of corruption. She walked up the steps, ignored the judge's chair, and stood behind the microphone. She looked down at the court clerk, who was trembling. "Justice Rodriguez," the clerk stammered. I didn't know you were here." "I have been watching from the control room for the last hour with Mr. Hale's associates," she said, her voice cool and crisp. "I wanted to see it for myself. I needed to see how deep the rot went." She looked at Paul Taggart, who was wiping his mouth with a handkerchief, looking ghostly pale. "Mr. Taggart," she said, "I am suspending your license to practice law pending an immediate ethics review. You are free to leave, though I suspect the FBI agents waiting in the lobby will have a different opinion on that matter." Taggart practically ran out of the room, fleeing the judgment of her eyes. Then Justice Rodriguez turned her gaze to Darius. Her expression softened. It wasn't pity, it was respect. "Mr. Webb," she said, "the judicial system is built on trust. Today, that trust was violated in the most grotesque manner possible. On behalf of the state, I offer you my deepest apologies." She picked up the gavel, Gannon's gavel. She held it for a moment, looking at it with distaste, as if it were contaminated. "The state moves to dismiss all charges," she announced. "Motion granted, with prejudice. This case is expunged from the record immediately. Mr. Webb, you are free to go." Bang! The sound of the gavel this time wasn't a threat. It was a liberation. Darius felt his knees give out. He slumped back into his chair, the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying from sadness. He was crying because the air had returned to his lungs. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was heavy, warm, and reassuring. "It's over, son," Alexander Hale whispered, leaning down. "You did it. You survived him." Darius looked up, his eyes meeting to the dark, intelligent eyes of the man who had just dismantled an entire corrupt empire for him. "We did it," Darius corrected him, his voice hoarse. Hale smiled, a genuine crinkling of the eyes that transformed his face. "Yes, we did. Now let's get out of here. I believe your mother is waiting, and I have a lot of explaining to do." As they stood up to leave, the gallery, composed of Darius's aunt, a few court regulars, and the now-awakened staff, erupted into applause. It wasn't polite golf claps. It was the cheering of people who had just watched a dragon get slain. Darius walked toward the aisle, not as a criminal, but as a victor. The doors opened, flooding the room with the late afternoon light, and for the first time in months, the future didn't look like a cell. It looked like gold. The walk from the courtroom doors to the curb was a gauntlet of chaos. The moment the double doors swung open, the humidity of the Georgia afternoon hit Darius like a physical weight. But it was nothing compared to the wall of sound that erupted from the bottom of the courthouse steps. News of Judge Gannon's arrest, a sitting judge hauled out in handcuffs by federal marshals, had traveled faster than light. The sidewalk was a sea of cameras, microphones, and shouting reporters. "Mr. Webb, Mr. Webb, did you know about the corruption? Mr. Hale, is it true you're the boy's father? Judge Gannon, look this way." Darius instinctively ducked his head, overwhelmed by the flashing strobes. He felt small again, just a kid in a thrift store suit, who had almost lost his life an hour ago. But then he felt a hand on his back. It was heavy, firm, and radiating a calm heat. "Head up, Darius." Alexander Hale's voice was close to his ear, low and commanding. "You have nothing to hide. You walked out of there a free man. Walk like one." Darius straightened his spine. He looked to his left. A few yards away, the spectacle was of a different nature. Judge Lawrence Gannon, the tyrant of Oakhaven, was being shoved into the back of a black federal SUV. His tie was undone, his expensive comb-over was flapping in the wind, and his face was a mask of sheer terror. For a brief second, Gannon's eyes met Darius's across the crowd. There was no sneer left, no power, just a silent, desperate plea from a man who knew his life was over. The heavy door of the SUV slammed shut, sealing Gannon inside his new reality. "Karma doesn't miss," Hale murmured. He guided Darius toward a sleek, charcoal-grey Bentley parked at the curb, its engine purring softly. A driver in a dark suit opened the rear door. Darius slid onto the cream-colored leather seats. The door thudded shut, instantly cutting off the screaming crowd. The silence inside the car was absolute, smelling of expensive cologne and air conditioning. As the car pulled away, gliding over the potholes of the city streets as if they didn't exist, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, confusing reality. Darius looked at the man sitting next to him. Alexander Hale was looking out the window, his jaw tight. Up close, Darius could see the resemblance. The same nose, the same set of the eyes, the same hands. "You have questions?" Hale said, not turning around. "Questions?" Darius let out a harsh, dry laugh. The shock was wearing off, and anger was taking its place. "Yeah, I have questions. You just blew up a courtroom. You told a federal judge I was your son, and now I'm in a Bentley." Darius turned in his seat, his voice rising. "Where were you? You said you've been watching me. You said you paid for things. But where were you when we got evicted from the 5th Street apartment when I was 10? Where were you when Mum had to sell her wedding ring to buy me asthma medicine? Where were you when I was sitting in that cell thinking my life was over?" Hale turned slowly. His eyes were red-rimmed. The titan of the courtroom looked suddenly fragile. "I was dying," Hale whispered. "Every single day, Darius. I was dying to be there." "That's not an answer," Darius snapped, tears stinging his eyes. "You're rich. You're powerful. You could have fixed everything. But you let us struggle." "I let you struggle so you wouldn't die," Hale said, his voice dropping to a brooding intensity. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a worn, creased photograph. He handed it to Darius. It was a picture of a car, a sedan, completely destroyed by fire, reduced to a skeleton of blackened metal. 19 years ago, Hale began, his voice steady but heavy with old pain. I wasn't Alexander Hale, the senior partner. I was Alex Hale, a federal prosecutor in Chicago. I was young, arrogant, and I went after the Varga cartel. They were trafficking children, Darius. They were monsters. I built a case that was going to put their entire leadership away for life. Darius looked at the photo, then at his father. 3 days before the trial, Hale continued, I went to start my car, but I forgot my briefcase in the house. I walked back toward the front door. That was the moment the car bomb went off. Darius gasped. They missed me by 30 seconds, Hale said, but the message was clear. The next bomb wouldn't be for me. It would be for Vanessa. She was 7 months pregnant with you. Hale looked out the window again as they passed the familiar, cracked sidewalks of Darius's neighborhood. I went to the DOJ. We realized there was a leak in my office. We couldn't trust witness protection. because the cartel had guys on the inside. So I had to make a choice. If I stayed with you, they would kill you both to get to me. The only way to save you was to make them believe I didn't care about you. Darius felt a chill run down his spine. So you left. I did worse than leave, Hale said, his voice trembling. I staged a fight. I screamed at your mother. I told her I didn't want the baby. I told her I was leaving her for my career. I broke her heart so completely that she would hate me enough to run away. I gave her cash, told her to disappear, and I stayed in Chicago to draw the fire. She hates you, Darius whispered. She never talks about you, but I see it in her eyes. She thinks you abandoned us. I know, Hale said, a single tear tracking down his cheek. It was the price I had to pay. I finished the trial. I put Varga away. But his brothers were still out there. So I stayed away. I hired private investigators to watch over you, ex-Navy SEALs, men I trusted with my life. That anonymous donor for your school, that was me. The clerical error that lowered your rent. That was me. I've been a ghost in your life, Darius. Because if I became flesh and blood, you became a target. So what changed? Darius asked. Why today? Why show up now? Because Varga's last brother died in prison 3 weeks ago, Hale said, turning to look Darius full in the face. The threat is gone. I was planning to come next month to explain everything properly. But then my surveillance team told me about Judge Gannon. They told me he was railroading you. Hale's expression hardened, the fierce lawyer returning. I sacrificed 18 years of being a father to keep you safe from criminals. I wasn't about to let a criminal in a black robe take you away from me now. Not when we were so close to the finish line. The car began to slow down. They had arrived. The setting sun cast long, orange shadows across the crumbling brick facade of the Cypress Creek apartments. It was a stark contrast to the luxury of the Bentley. There were weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. A stray dog barked in the distance. Darius looked at his home. Then he looked at his father. Does she know? No, Hale said, adjusting his cufflinks, though his hands were shaking slightly. She thinks I'm the devil. She's home, Darius said, pointing to the second-floor window where a light flickered. She took the day off to cry. The driver opened the door. Darius stepped out, his legs feeling heavy. Hale stepped out beside him. The juxtaposition was jarring, the man in the $5,000 suit standing in a parking lot stained with oil and neglect. They walked up the stairs in silence. The metal railing rattled under Darius's hand. He reached the door, apartment 2B, and hesitated. He could hear the TV on inside. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Mum? Vanessa Webb was sitting at the small kitchen table, her head in her hands. She was wearing her diner uniform, stained with coffee. She looked exhausted, worn down by 20 years of fighting a battle she couldn't win. She looked up, her eyes swollen. When she saw Darius, she screamed. Darius! She knocked her chair over, rushing across the small room to bury him in a hug so tight it hurt. She sobbed into his shoulder, her whole body shaking. I saw the news. I saw the judge was arrested. They said the charges were dropped. Oh God, baby, I thought I lost you. I'm here, Mom. I'm safe. Darius soothed her, rubbing her back. I'm not going anywhere. How? She pulled back, framing his face with her hands, checking for bruises. The news said a lawyer from D.C. came in. Who? We can't afford a lawyer. He didn't charge us, Mom, Darius said softly. He stepped aside. Alexander Hale was standing in the doorway. He had taken off his sunglasses. He filled the doorframe, a ghost brought back to life. Vanessa froze. Her hands dropped from Darius's face. The color drained from her skin, leaving her ashen. She stared at him, her breath hitching in short, painful gasps. The silence stretched for an eternity, heavy with 18 years of secrets. "Hello, Vanessa," Hale said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Get out," Vanessa hissed. The shock was instantly replaced by a volcanic rage. She stepped in front of Darius, shielding him. "Get out of my house! You don't get to be here! You don't get to come back!" "Vanessa, please!" Hale took a step forward, his hands raised in surrender. "No!" she screamed, grabbing a ceramic mug from the table and hurling it at him. It smashed against the doorframe, shattering into pieces. "You left us! You left him! Do you know what we went through? Do you know how hard it was? You coward!" "I know," Hale shouted back, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know because I watched every second of it." "You watched?" Vanessa stopped, trembling. "You watched?" "The car bomb, Ness," Hale said, tears flowing freely now. "The bomb in Chicago. It wasn't an accident. Varga tried to kill me, and he sent a message that you were next." Vanessa went still. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," Hale said, walking slowly into the room, ignoring the shattered glass on the floor. "I left because loving you was a death sentence. I had to make you hate me so you would run. I had to stay behind to take the bullets." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another photo. It was a picture of Vanessa and a baby Darius, taken from a distance at a park in Oak Haven 17 years ago. "I have carried this photo in my pocket every single day for 18 years, Hale choked out. "I have never loved anyone else. I have never had another family. You are my family, and I am begging you, please forgive me for saving your life." Vanessa looked at the photo. Then she looked at the man. She saw the grey in his hair. She saw the lines of sorrow etched into his face, lines that mirrored her own. She saw the truth. The anger drained out of her, leaving her knees weak. She swayed, and Hale was there in an instant, catching her. "I'm sorry," he wept into her hair, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I'm so sorry it took so long." Darius watched them. He saw his mother, who had been made of steel for so long, finally allow herself to be soft. He saw his father, a man who commanded courtrooms and destroyed judges, falling apart in a rundown kitchen. It was over. The running, the fear, the poverty. Epilogue. The fallout was swift and brutal, in the best possible way. Judge Lawrence Gannon didn't just go to jail. He was dismantled. The RICO investigation Alexander Hale initiated uncovered a decade of corruption. Gannon had been taking kickbacks from private detention centers for every child he sentenced. He was denied bail. 3 months later, he pled guilty to avoid a life sentence. He is currently serving 25 years at FCI Coleman, a maximum security facility, where, ironically, he cleans the floors of the cafeteria. Paul Taggart, the prosecutor, turned state's witness to save his own skin, but he was disbarred permanently. He currently works as a night manager at a gas station 3 towns over. As for the Webb family, well, they aren't the Webbs anymore. 2 weeks after the trial, Darius and Vanessa moved out of the Cypress Creek apartments. They didn't move into a mansion. Vanessa said that was too much change too fast, but into a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the quiet suburbs of D.C., near Alexander's firm. Darius didn't just go to Georgia Tech. He went with a full ride, not from a scholarship, but from a trust fund his father had been building since the day he was born. He studies pre-law. He wants to be a defense attorney. On the day Darius left for college, the 3 of them stood in the driveway. The fear was gone from Vanessa's eyes, replaced by a light Darius hadn't seen since he was a child. Alexander had his arm around her, looking at peace. You ready, son? Hale asked. Darius threw his bags into the back of his new car. He looked at his parents, united, strong, and finally safe. Yeah, Darius smiled. I'm ready. Justice is waiting. Wow, I still get chills thinking about the look on Judge Gannon's face when those double doors flew open. Talk about immediate karma. He thought he could bully a helpless kid, but he ended up facing the one man in the country who could take him down. It just goes to show you, you never know who someone is or who is watching out for them. Judge Gannon is now serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, and Darius graduated with honors from Georgia Tech last spring. His dad, Alexander, retired from law to spend every day with his family. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more stories where the corrupt get what they deserve, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let me know in the comments. Do you think the dad was right to stay away to protect them? Or should he have come back sooner? I'll be reading your replies. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.